A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was reading this analysis yesterday about the collapse of the rules-based international order, and it struck me how often the pundits use the word realpolitik as if it is a dirty word. They treat it like a synonym for being a villain or lacking a soul. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that very term. He wants us to unpack what realpolitik actually means, especially as it relates to the messy geopolitical reality we are living through here in March of 2026.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I'm so glad Daniel sent this one in because the common understanding of realpolitik is basically a cartoon version of history. People hear the word and they think of Otto von Bismarck in a spiked helmet or some shadowy figure in a basement plotting world domination. But in the academic and strategic sense, it is much more like physics. It is the study of how states behave when you strip away the polite speeches at the United Nations and look at the cold, hard mechanics of survival. It is not about being evil, Corn. It is about being structural.
It feels like the world has had a very rude awakening over the last few years. We went from this era of liberal internationalism where we thought everyone was going to play by the same set of rules because it was the right thing to do, to a world that feels much more like the 19th century. Is realpolitik a strategy that leaders choose, or is it just the default state of the world when the fluff stops working?
That is the big debate in international relations theory. On one side, you have the idealists or the liberal internationalists who believe that institutions, trade, and shared values can fundamentally change how nations act. They think we can evolve past conflict. Realpolitik, or realism, argues that the system itself is the problem. It is built on the idea of anarchy. Now, when I say anarchy, I do not mean chaos in the streets. I mean the absence of a higher authority. There is no world government with a monopoly on force. If a country gets invaded, there is no 911 to call that can actually stop the tanks. Because of that, every state has to be responsible for its own survival. It is a self-help system, plain and simple.
So if you assume no one is coming to save you, your entire perspective on friendship between nations changes. It becomes transactional. You are not friends with a neighbor because you like their culture. You are aligned with them because your interests happen to overlap for this specific moment in time.
You hit the nail on the head. In realism, the primary unit is the state, and the primary goal is survival through power. And power is not just military might, though that is the ultimate currency. It is economic weight, resource control, and technological edge. What we are seeing in 2026 is a return to this structural reality. For a few decades, the United States was so dominant that it could afford to pretend the rules mattered more than raw power. It could subsidize the rules-based order. But as we have moved into this multipolar instability, the subsidy is gone and the raw interests are showing through the floorboards.
It reminds me of that conversation we had back in episode 1143 about the myth of unbreakable bonds. We talked about how alliances are really just temporary vehicles for shared interests. If the interest disappears, the alliance becomes a liability. But let us get into the actual mechanisms here. If I am a leader looking at the world through the lens of realpolitik, what am I actually calculating?
You are looking at the security dilemma. This is a concept popularized by John Herz back in 1950, and it is more relevant today than ever. The idea is that in an anarchic system, anything a state does to increase its own security is automatically perceived as a threat by its neighbors. If I build a defensive wall, you wonder why I'm so worried. Are you planning something? So you build a bigger wall. Then I see your bigger wall and I buy a new fleet of autonomous drone swarms. It is a cycle of escalation where even if both parties are genuinely just trying to defend themselves, they end up in an arms race that makes everyone less safe.
And we're seeing that play out with drone proliferation right now. It is not just about having the most soldiers anymore. It is about who has the best algorithms and the most resilient supply chains for semiconductors. Which leads me to something I have been thinking about regarding power projection. In the old days, power was about how many miles of territory you could hold, but in 2026 we have this concept of cyber sovereignty. Does Realpolitik apply when the territory is a digital network or a satellite constellation?
It applies even more intensely because the borders are invisible and the reaction times are faster. In the traditional realist view, geography is destiny, which we took a deep dive into during episode 1382. But today, the high ground is the cloud. If you control the undersea cables or the low Earth orbit infrastructure, you have the ability to project power without ever crossing a physical border. Realpolitik in 2026 means realizing that if you do not own the stack, you do not own your sovereignty. Look at the shift in energy security alliances we have seen over the last year in the global south. Countries are not picking sides based on who has the better democracy score. They are picking sides based on who can guarantee the delivery of modular nuclear reactors and who can provide the compute power for their national industries.
It is a pivot toward material reality. You see these countries that used to give these long, flowery speeches about human rights, and now they are signing massive trade deals with whoever can keep the lights on and the internet running. It feels like a loss of moral clarity to some people, but from a realist perspective, it is just rational. If your people are starving or your grid is failing, your moral standing does not mean much.
There is a trade-off there that people hate to acknowledge. When a state abandons moral signaling for strategic gain, they lose soft power. Soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion. The United States used to be the master of this. Everyone wanted the American dream, so they followed the American lead. But when you move to a purely transactional Realpolitik model, you are essentially saying, I do not care if you like me as long as you fear me or need me. That works in the short term, but it is expensive. You have to constantly prove your utility or your strength because there is no underlying loyalty to fall back on.
Well, and that transactional nature is being hard-coded into law now. We have talked about the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Act that passed in January. That was a massive piece of legislation that basically told the world the era of globalized efficiency is over. It mandates that critical infrastructure components must be sourced from aligned nations. It is not about who is the cheapest anymore. It is about who is safe. That is Realpolitik in legislative form. It is the state stepping in and saying the market is too dangerous to be left to the economists. The strategists are taking over.
That act is a perfect case study. For 30 years, we were told that trade would make war impossible because we would all be too interconnected. That was the Golden Arches theory of conflict. But the realists warned that interdependence is actually a vulnerability. If I depend on you for my medicine and you depend on me for your energy, we are not friends. We are hostages to each other. The January 2026 Act is an attempt to end that hostage situation. It is a deliberate decoupling. It is saying we would rather pay 20% more for a router made in an allied nation than save money on one that could have a kill switch embedded by an adversary.
It makes me think about how we model this stuff now. Back in episode 662, we explored the geopolitical graph and how AI is being used to map global power. If you are a leader today, you are not just looking at a map on a wall. You are looking at a dynamic, real-time simulation of trade flows, sentiment analysis, and resource depletion. Does that make Realpolitik more scientific? Or does it just make it more dangerous because we think we can predict the unpredictable?
It makes the calculations more precise, which can actually lead to more aggression. If your AI model tells you that your window of military superiority is going to close in 18 months, the rational realist move is to strike now while you have the advantage. This is what they call preventive war. In the past, leaders had to guess about their relative strength. Now they have dashboards. But the danger is that everyone else has those same dashboards. If both sides see the same optimal time per conflict, you get a collision that might have been avoided if things were a bit more fuzzy.
This really changes the game for multinational corporations, too. You used to be able to be a citizen of the world. You could have your headquarters in one place, your factories in another, and your customers everywhere. But in this 2026 reality, neutrality is essentially disappearing. If you're a big tech firm or a manufacturing giant, the state is coming to you and saying, whose side are you on? Because your supply chain is now a matter of national security.
The corporate world is having a very hard time adjusting to this. They spent decades optimizing for just-in-time delivery and global efficiency. Now they have to optimize for just-in-case, resiliency, and political alignment. We saw this with the massive tech shifts after the 12-day war earlier this year. Companies that tried to maintain a foot in both camps found themselves getting squeezed by both sides. Sanctions on one hand, nationalization on the other. In a realpolitik world, the middle ground is a very lonely and dangerous place to stand.
So, if we're looking at the signals in the news, how do we tell the difference between a genuine diplomatic shift and just more theater? Because I see these leaders meeting and shaking hands, but then 3 days later they are moving carrier groups or signing exclusive mineral rights deals.
You have to look for the divergence between the rhetoric and the interest anchor. If a leader is talking about eternal friendship and shared democratic values, that is the music. But if you want to see the sheet music, look at the trade agreements and the security guarantees. If the eternal friend is not willing to sign a binding defense pact or share high-end semiconductor manufacturing tech, then they are not an ally. They are a partner of convenience. Realpolitik signals are found in the things that are hard to reverse. Moving a factory is hard. Signing a 30-year energy contract is hard. Making a speech is easy.
That is a great way to put it. The interest anchor is what keeps the ship from drifting when the wind changes. And right now, the wind is blowing in every direction at once. I think about the 2022 era where we saw these values-based blocks forming, where everyone was talking about the democracy versus autocracy divide. But by 2026, that has shifted into these shifting interest-based alliances. You have countries that are ideologically opposite, but are working together because they both need to hedge against a third power. It is much more cynical, but perhaps more stable in a weird way.
Some realists argue that it is actually safer because it is predictable. If I know you are acting in your own interest, I can work with that. I can offer you something you want in exchange for something I want. But if you are acting on ideology or divine mission, I cannot negotiate with you. There is no middle ground with a fanatic. Realpolitik, for all its coldness, is at least a language that everyone speaks. It provides a safety valve of sorts. You can always make a deal if the price is right. The problem is when the price becomes existential.
Like when we look at the situation in the Middle East or the South China Sea. If the interest is the very survival of the state or the control of a resource that has no substitute, then the room for negotiation disappears. That is the point where realpolitik stops being a chess game and starts being a demolition derby.
And that is the risk of the world we are entering. When every state acts purely on its own transactional interests, you lose the lubricant of international law and shared norms. Those things might have been a bit of a polite fiction, but they gave leaders an off-ramp. They could back down from a conflict and save face by saying they were respecting the international process. In a pure realpolitik world, backing down is just a sign of weakness. It invites more aggression.
It feels like we're going back to the 19th century balance of power model, but with 21st century tech. Instead of the concert of Europe, we have the concert of algorithms, but the human element is still there. You still have leaders with egos and fears. Herman, you've been following the research on how AI-driven predictive modeling is affecting the security dilemma we mentioned earlier. Are these tools making leaders more cautious or more bold?
It is a bit of both. Some leaders use the data to realize that a conflict would be devastatingly expensive, so they find a way to settle, but others use it to find the perfect moment to strike. The most interesting development in 2026 has been automated diplomacy, where AI systems are used to find complex multi-party trade-offs that a human negotiator might miss. Like, I will give you these fishing rights if you give him those mineral rights and he gives me this satellite access. It is a massive three-dimensional game of bartering. It is realpolitik at a scale that the human brain can barely track.
That sounds like a fascinating and terrifying world to live in. It is like the entire planet is being managed by a high-frequency trading algorithm, but the stocks are actual lives and sovereign borders.
It really is. And for the average person, the takeaway is that you cannot rely on the old rules anymore. You have to understand that the people running the show are looking at a very different map than the one we see in the headlines. If you are a business owner or an investor, you have to be looking for those interest anchors. Do not bet on an alliance lasting just because the leaders had a nice dinner together. Look at the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Act, compliance. Look at the energy dependencies. Those are the things that will determine who is standing a year from now.
So, for our listeners who are trying to navigate this, what is the Realpolitik lite version of advice? How do you identify the signals in your own life or business?
First, recognize that ideological consistency is a luxury for the powerful and the secure. Most of the world does not have that luxury. If you see a country or a company doing something that seems hypocritical, do not just dismiss it as bad character. Ask yourself, what material interest are they protecting? Usually, the hypocrisy is just the gap between their public-facing idealism and their private-facing realism. If you can see that gap, you can predict their next move.
Second, do not get caught in the security dilemma in your own professional life. If you see a competitor making a move, do not automatically assume it is an offensive attack that requires a massive escalation. Sometimes a wall is just a wall. But in the geopolitical sense, you have to assume that everyone else is playing the realist game, even if they are wearing an idealist mask. If you are the only one playing by the old rules, you're going to get eaten.
And finally, keep an eye on the decapitation doctrine we discussed in episode 1202. In a realpolitik world, the focus is often on removing the will of the adversary by targeting their most critical nodes, whether that is their energy grid, their financial system, or their leadership. The era of limited war for limited goals is fading. In 2026, if you go to war, you go for the throat because the cost of a long, drawn-out conflict is too high in a hyper-connected world.
That is a sobering thought to end on, but it is the reality of the map we are looking at. Realpolitik is not an endorsement of evil. It is an acknowledgement of the structural constraints of a world without a global supervisor. It is about understanding the physics of power so you do not get crushed by it.
It is about seeing the world as it is, not as we wish it would be. And as we see from the shifting alliances and the interest-based diplomacy of 2026, the world is a much colder and more transactional place than the history books of the 1990s promised us.
Well, I think we have unpacked the real in Realpolitik today. It is a deep rabbit hole, and honestly, we could probably spend another 10 episodes on the nuances of offensive realism versus defensive realism, but I think we have given people a good framework to start with.
There is always more to dig into, especially as the data from the recent conflicts starts to get fully analyzed by the think tanks. But for now, the key is to watch the resources and the tech. Everything else is just a press release.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and the synthesis that makes this show possible.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives helpful for navigating this strange era of 2026, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation.
We will be back soon with another prompt. Until then, stay curious and keep your eyes on the interest anchors.
Goodbye, everyone.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.